citizen.
Out of many
We are world citizens, same vision is for equal rights and justice for the people them. What's happening to this beautiful world that we're living in? World citizen, lift up your voice.
Welcome to another episode of the People Powered Planet podcast, where each week we bring you solutionaries from around the world who have creative ideas on how we solve the problems facing the world. There are so many podcasts about all the problems, and if that problem wasn't bad enough, it's worse than that and more worse than that. And we focus on people who've got solutions that can really shift our world and can really build what Gary Davis, our mentor and inspirer, called a people-powered planet. Without further ado, I want to introduce our guest. John Reuwer is a member of the World Beyond War, Physicians for Social Responsibility, working on their nuclear issues. He's a former emergency room physician, and he was an international protection officer working with the Nonviolent Peaceforce and serving in many countries around the world, including also U.S. cities, helping to try to de-escalate the violence around the Capitol insurrection. But he's on nonviolent peace teams in South Sudan, Haiti, Guatemala, Colombia, Palestine, Israel, etc. And he's just returned from a month in Romania and Ukraine, meeting with people there, working on the issue of nonviolence. So welcome to our program, John.
Thank you, Arthur. Glad to be here.
Well, let's start first by you telling us a little bit more about you and what took you to Ukraine in this recently.
So as an emergency physician, I spent about 30 years treating people for what they do to each other and do to themselves in situations of conflict. And after that much work at that, I thought, now is the time to help people figure out how to get along in life, get what they need without hurting each other. Prevention is always better than treatment. And so when I look at the world and see what conflicts can do, I see that war is the epitome of human inability to be rational with one another. When you work yourself into such a frenzy that the only solution you can think of is to kill the other person, and beyond that, bomb whole cities, kill children, wipe out the environment, and all the other bad things war does, that there must be solutions. And so for almost 40 years, I've studied the works of Martin Luther King and Gandhi and Gene Sharp, trying to figure out what are all the substitutes you do for dealing with the problem of evil, the problem of people who you believe are enemies, those you're convinced are trying to hurt you, without becoming what they are. Then I've gone to conflict situations, as the places you mentioned, Arthur, to look for people who actually have to deal with it. It's one thing to sit home comfortably and safe and speculate on those things, but it's important to be as near to the conflict as possible. And that was my motivation for going to the Ukraine. Does anything I believe in terms of peace and nonviolence make much sense when you're actually under invasion and bombardment?
Wow. Well, I think about the fact that that Ukraine people celebrate their heroic struggle, but when we think about the incredible singing revolution in the Latvian countries that really successfully defeated an invasion of Soviet tanks and turned back the tanks with only 14 deaths instead of with thousands and thousands, and more throughout Eastern Europe. Tell us more about what you saw as the role of nonviolence in the breakup of the Soviet Union, and let's start with that.
Well, like I'm guessing many of the people on this call, I grew up with the propaganda, I'll call it now, of being told that the Soviet Union and Russia were the greatest evil on earth, and they had designs on conquering the whole world for atheism and destroying all freedom. And the only thing that could stop their military might was more military might, in particular, nuclear weapons. So I grew up in an era where we were building bomb shelters and expecting nuclear war and not thinking there was any other way. And so just as I began to study all this material, lo and behold, the people of the Warsaw Pact and Russia itself seemed to just miraculously over the course of a year wake up and say, no, we're not going to play that game anymore. And these governments that were so tyrannical just all fell just because people refused to cooperate with them. So it validated everything I had learned from these masters of nonviolence.
I mean, here we had that massive, massive shift. And we've been told, for decades, like you said, that there was only one way, that the only thing that the Russians understand is force. And why didn't the world recognize that incredible lesson? What happened? Why was it almost like a non-event to the whole war system?
Well, it was a big event to the people of the world. If you look at military spending in the early 90s after the fall of the Soviet Union, it went down for the first time. There was a peace dividend. We were talking about all sorts of things. In Virginia, where I was living, we had this congested 2-lane interstate for decades that was just a mess with traffic jams. And there was talk about, oh, now we can make it 4 lanes and really build infrastructure to get people taken care of better throughout the world. And then in over really less than 10 years, the war system just began to take back over. And we could talk a lot about what drives that, but we invested in war rather than peace. The way I look at it is, if you look at the fall of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, which just dissolved, was really no threat to anyone. The NATO could have done the same thing, just dissolved, and all the money spent keeping it could have been used for other things. But it was spent instead increasing NATO. The United States, I just looked this up using the data from the Stockholm Peace Research Institute. The US alone spent $16.5 trillion getting ready for the next set of wars after the fall of Russia and the Soviet Union. And our total diplomatic efforts, if you add the State Department, USAID, Peace Corps, everything we do that formally is supposed to be making peace, it was about 900 billion. So 16.5 trillion to 900 billion is no wonder then that we got more war instead of peace. It's where the money is. And I don't know if you need to get into deeper explanations. You can talk forever about geopolitics, and NATO should have done this and that, and Ukraine is part of Russia and part of the West, and all the local politics that matter and contribute to the war. But do you need a bigger explanation other than that's where the money is? That's where we pour all our energy, and not just money, but the genius of our youth and our scientists. I have lots of relatives who work for the military-industrial complex, enormous brain power, just getting ready for war. Why are we surprised that's what we get?
Well, it seems like there was a panic when our Russian enemy disappeared. They tried to find some enemies. They got Somalia, that didn't do much, or Panama, and there really wasn't enough to keep justifying the huge military-industrial complex. Then they came up with the war on terror, a fabulous invention because it keeps creating more terror, self-generates. It's a great way to pour funds in, but even that doesn't seem to be adequate for their hunger. So I think Eisenhower's warning of the military-industrial complex, is that really the crux of the challenge?
It sure seems like it to me. If you look at where the push for war is, there's so much lobbying and money from the military-industrial complex that buys not only Congress. I mean, Congress has to be the cheapest thing in the world to buy, right? A few $1 million in each campaign, and you get tens of billions of dollars in military contracts in return. I wish I could invest in something that had such a great rate of return. And then you buy think tanks, you buy people to make up all the stories about why China and Russia and terrorists are the greatest enemies in the world, contrary to all actual evidence. And then you just pay and buy the media to repeat the story over and over and over again, and people buy it. We know from the studies of propaganda how incredibly effective it is, and the people making money on this have done a brilliant job. The problem with the rest of us, of course, is through our educations and maybe even our intuition, it just seems like even if we want to be peaceful, that violence is the final arbiter of conflict, that you might want diplomacy and to be nice and to do other things. But when an enemy is really coming at you with weapons, that you want the biggest weapons and the greatest warriors to defend you. That comes, of course, from every cop show and every war movie I watched almost in my life, where the good guys never win by being good. They win by out-violencing the bad guys. So you put that education we have, which I think is very unrealistic, with the money and lobbying for weapons, and you get this toxic combination that, if we don't change it soon, is going to destroy the world.
Wow, you've really encapsulated the challenge in a very clear, crisp way. So let's segue from that specifically to to Ukraine. Given the incredible history of nonviolent revolutions successfully fighting Russia over and over again, as you just mentioned, and of course, why was there a possibility that Ukraine was at first going to turn to a nonviolent revolution, and what sidetracked that, and what's the possibilities for nonviolence now?
Well, I was almost a little bit excited at the beginning of this war because of what little I knew of Ukraine. I said, this is going to be the first real experiment and the real demonstration of what nonviolence can do. And we all saw it in the first 2 or 3 weeks, right? We saw people at Zaporizhia blocking by the thousands tanks from coming in and delayed them for quite some time. And I learned on my trip to Ukraine that it happened in lots and lots of places around Ukraine where villages just blocked the troops. They went out to negotiate with the troops and they delayed the invasion of their particular towns. And then they rescued their leaders when they were arrested and so forth by Russian troops. I heard lots and lots of stories of things that happened. We saw Russian soldiers that had either deserted or been captured. Instead of being beaten up and put in prison, they were given cups of coffee and cell phones to call their moms. We saw signs being changed to confuse all the invaders. In Belarus, so many of the entire train system refused to transport a lot of the Russian war material into the country. And it was probably the single biggest success of nonviolent resistance so far in this war. And in that it showed Lukashenko, the dictator there, that he didn't have the support of the people to send Belarusian troops into Ukraine. That was a huge nonviolent success. But then after 2 or 3 weeks, if you noticed, it seemed like, from my point of view, it all disappeared. There was just no more news about anything. And what happened, I think, was just the fact that we started sending billions and then tens and then multiple tens of billions of dollars of weapons in there. And it just buried everything in a barrage of violence, which, at least if you read all the way the war looked like it was going on, it was very successful for the Ukrainians. The Russian troops eventually evacuated from the attacks around their capital city and started holding the Russians at bay in the east. And so you can't blame the Ukrainians for doing that. Now, just imagine, though, if instead of weapons, we had sent literally billions of dollars worth of aid into assisting all that nonviolent action. And what makes it hard to imagine is we haven't had good examples of that. We do know that when the Russians invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968, rather than putting up a violent resistance, they accepted the occupation and didn't have to give up their government. It was changed a few months later, but no one was killed. Their country wasn't destroyed. And yes, they had to wait another 19 years to get total freedom, but they did without destroying the country. And the Danes faced a much bigger threat from Hitler in 1941 than the Ukrainians have now. And they just also allowed themselves to be occupied and then just torture the Germans to the end until they just left without destroying the country again and save the moral fabric of their society. That's the main reason to use nonviolence. Because even if the Ukrainians win this war, you're just sowing the seeds of the next war. You're going to have so much hate within Ukraine itself because of people that were on opposite sides killing one another and so forth. The trauma from that will last generations. I think it was Gandhi that says that the little bit of good, or the good that violence seems to do, is always temporary, and the harm it does is always permanent.
Well, when you were mentioning the Danes' resistance to the Nazis, you used the word tortured, but I think what were you talking about in terms of the way they handled their nonviolent resistance to the Nazis?
Yeah, not the best choice of word, torture there. Just kept poking at the Nazis in a way that would really discourage them. In other words, the thing the Danes had the most to offer Germany was some of the best shipbuilders in the world. And as I understand it, these guys would say, sure, we'll build that ship for you. But then at the end of each day, all the rivets didn't come in. All this welding was bad. I had to redo it. There wasn't a single ship finished, as I understand, in 4 years for the Germans. The only ships finished had to be towed into German ports to finish them. That kind of cleverness, it sounds kind of superficial clever, but it actually worked in history. And almost without any preparation, almost spontaneously. Imagine if you took the the many years and billions of dollars and trained people in how to do all this stuff, how effective it would be.
Right. And you know the story about the king and the flag, right? The Nazi flag.
Well, when they talked about rounding up, the first step in rounding up all the Jews was to require them to wear a star to identify themselves as Jews. And the king himself came out wearing a star and asked everybody to wear them, so the Germans couldn't distinguish Jews from non-Jews. There's an infinite number of clever human things you can do once you take killing your enemy off the table.
Right. And as I understand it, the Nazis put up a Nazi flag, and we're going to, and the king said, if you don't take down that flag, no, he said, I'm going to send a soldier to take down that flag and put the Danish flag back on. And they said, then we'll shoot that soldier. And he said, I am that soldier, right?
I hadn't heard that story, but I like it.
Yeah. So here we've seen these powerful examples of nonviolence, and then somehow the mythology of war and the mythology that's well backed in the military-industrial complex's penetration of the movie and TV industry. So it's both a cultural and a monetary buy-off. So in a way, this war was purchased as a way to weaken as a way to try to weaken Russia. Is that possible?
Well, it certainly looks that way if you look at the way NATO did everything to preserve itself when it was no longer needed during the 90s and the first part of this century. And it looks that way if you look at all the lobbying the military people do and their paid think tanks did to prove that you could never deal with Russia and you still had to militarize and so forth. The creation of enemies, it looks that way. From a Ukrainian point of view, I'm not sure certainly the average Ukrainian sees it that way at all.
No, of course not. And I mean, that's a gross oversimplification. But if we had taken your idea that, of pouring in aid to support the nonviolence instead, could have gotten Russia out of their country and preserved their country, what a more attractive alternative. Well, so tell me now, what did you find on this current trip? And what do you see as the possibilities for nonviolent resolution or any resolution of the invasion at this point?
Well, I must say I was somewhat taken back because I tried to go into Ukraine almost immediately and just didn't know of a group that was looking for the things I was looking for. So I waited and finally went with the Romanian Peace Institute, which had done peace building work for the last 25 years. Mediated all kinds of conflicts, taught all kinds of courses, trained people. And at the beginning of the war, I talked to them initially, but they stopped all their peace building activities to contribute to the humanitarian aid. They were the first people across the border in with humanitarian aid in the first days of the war. And they put all their considerable resources into supporting Ukrainians that needed it. So when I got there, the idea was to resume a lot of their peace building work. And so I worked with them in Romania for a while, and they continued their humanitarian work because once you start, it just can't stop. While we planned this trip to meet people who had been doing nonviolent resistance in Ukraine, and I had the chance to interview a number of refugees, some of whom had come from peace organizations. And it was shocked that almost everybody I talked to, when I asked, what do you need from my government? They said more weapons. So I finally get into Ukraine and we're meeting with some government organizations, but that we're into conflict resolution and teaching people how to get along and so forth, youth in particular, and heard a lot of great stories about how the work those groups had been doing made the resistance that the Ukrainians have showed. I mean, the Ukrainians have shocked the world in how well they've rallied to resist this invasion. And one of the best ways they've done that is to continue with their normal lives and to rescue each other. Instead of devolving into a lot of bickering, these groups that have been trained in peace building were the first to organize the humanitarian aid, the relief agencies, feed people, move people, and work with each other in a way. So that part of the peace building had been highly successful and highly contributed to the way the Ukrainians have been able to resist. None of them, however, had been trained in what we call civilian-based defense or doing the kind of things that the Danes did or the people in Estonia did in the singing revolution. They weren't prepared. They just didn't have the numbers to do that. And again, they didn't have any support for doing that. It wasn't like our government came in and said, okay, let's resist the way you've done it before. We'll send you whatever aid you need. If you need to evacuate an area because you think they're going to kill you, we'll help you evacuate. If you need money to rally people and have the best satellite cell phones and everything the Russians can't jam, we could do that. But there was none of that. It was here's a Stinger missile. And if you're a young Ukrainian guy and you say, okay, let's read this manual and talk about how we're going to do nonviolent resistance, or you can take the Stinger and knock out a Russian helicopter all by yourself. If you're a young guy, which sounds more appealing? It's
a video game.
Yeah, and we sent tens of thousands of those kind of weapons in. I mean, billions and billions of dollars worth. And just I'll note two things that I guarantee you're going to see. One is one of those missiles, which allows a single person to knock out an airliner, is going to hit a civilian airliner sometime in the next year or so, because nobody is taking the names of everybody that's using those weapons. And when you flood tens of thousands of these things, some of them go in the black market. And Ukraine was generally recognized as the most corrupt country in Europe before this war, which is why they weren't allowed into NATO before, weren't even allowed into the European Union, because they were too corrupt, and they were working on fixing all that. But all that corruption and all these weapons, you're going to see terrific violence come out of this, no matter how the war goes.
Wow, that's very sobering. When you talking about the violence that's erupting out of it, I also noticed in your bio that when you were working on nonviolent peace teams in U.S. cities, that you were also trying to de-escalate the tensions around the January 6th insurrection or attempted. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, as part of the DC Peace Team, which has been working in the DC area and a few other places for the last 10 years or so, training groups of people to go out in the streets during political demonstrations and other times of stress by invitation of whoever's organizing those events, and being on the street to talk to people, to look for the warning signs of violence and to interrupt that when we find it. And it's incredibly effective. I mean, I want to say one of the days in January, I don't know if it's or December 12th, when the first big rally after Trump lost the election, there were Black Lives Matter protesters still in the streets, and a young Trump supporter came over and they started screaming at each other in the street and escalating. And at one point, this guy just pulls out a knife. The one guy pulls out a knife and says, okay, come here and get it. And just one of our team just stepped in the middle between the two and said, hey, friend, we don't need to do that. That's not going to make anything better. Let's put that down and you can go your way or talk, whatever you want to do. And the guy does it. If that hadn't been there, that could have been a stabbing or a start of a small riot. There were police officers within sight who didn't see that fast, that might or might not have stopped that, or they might have come over and made things worse. But that's the kind of de-escalation you do. On January 6th, I could watch the assault on the Capitol from such a distance because the people packed against the Capitol were so impressive. But the strange thing was, I said, I've been to lots of peace demonstrations in this city over the decades, and I've never seen people in those kind of numbers holding signs that implied violence get that close to the Capitol. It was so clear that somebody gave the order to allow that to happen to me. I'd never seen the city behave that way before.
Wow, that's very sobering too. I do want to just add one more item from my own experience, and that is when, shortly after, within 2 weeks after Lithuania became the first country to officially completely secede from the Soviet Union, Gary Davis gave a world passport to Landsbergis, who was the first head of state. When I went to Lithuania, because that was where my ancestors were from, on a Rotary trip, I had the joy of getting to meet with him, and he told me, and I gave him a renewal of his passport, and he was very pleased to get it. He said he was so happy that Gary Davis had given him that passport, because the only passport he had was a Soviet diplomatic passport, And when he wanted to travel, he didn't want to use the passport of the country he had just renounced and withdrawn from. So he said, so I go to the border and I push them the world passport and they stamp it. He said that was so funny. He told me the story about it. So he was very pleased to have that. And Victor Havel was also said that the world passport was his only passport. So when these countries seceded from the Soviet Union and had no passports of their own yet, the world passport played a really key role. And so when I went there, it was very interesting because everyone in the society remembered so much about the Singing Revolution. Our tour guide said, I was on the top of this building and the Soviet tanks were trying to take over our parliament building and their TV station. And so when I would be up there and I'd say, tanks are coming down, Independence Avenue or something. And everybody would rush toward the tanks and block them. Nobody ran away from them. And, they mourn the 14 lives that were lost in that, but they succeeded. I mean, they beat the Soviet tank invasion. The tank invaders couldn't continue. And so there is such a powerful force in the world, incredible that our task, I think, is our big task is how do we bring that into the popular culture in such a powerful way that it can counter the money that's being poured into the weapons industry and the illusion that there's such a thing as military power when the most powerful empires in the world can't beat the smallest countries in the world over and over again. We don't learn the lesson that doesn't work.
That's a really good point. It's amazing to me how effective propaganda is over reality. I mean, when's the last time the United States won a war with all its nuclear weapons, with a military the size of almost everybody else combined, still really can't win a war? You've got to think that something else is wrong. But again, it's every TV show, every cop show is always the good guys killing the bad guys or beating them up or something. But
it's not just the United States that can't. None of the empires can win a war. The French Empire couldn't beat the French. The Chinese Empire couldn't beat the Vietnamese. The Chinese Empire tried for 1,000 years to beat the Vietnamese. They couldn't do it. The French couldn't. We couldn't. And then in Afghanistan, the mighty Russian Empire tried to beat tribesmen there. Then the U.S. for 20 years. The empire, and now of course Russia and Ukraine. These mighty empires, for all their military power, far zillion to one outspending, outgunning the people of a country, can't do it. I mean, the whole imperial system fell to much to people who didn't have the kind of power and guns and money. And yet somehow we don't wake up to the fact that power is illusory, that there's no such thing as real military power.
No, hard power, military power only works when people believe in it. And that's why the Soviet Union could fall so easily, and why the Estonians could win, and why the Filipino people could beat Marcos in 1986, and on, thousands or many hundreds of cases in history. Because it's ultimately, I believe, what the power is in human determination, in the legitimacy that the mass of people give to whatever the system is. So if you believe that the military is the way to go, that's where you'll put your money and that's where you'll support, and it'll seem to be successful. If you put it into anything else, like the Estonians did, like the Filipinos did, like the Ukrainians did in 2004 Orange Revolution, if you put your effort in to anything else, it's that legitimacy and desire of the people that matter. So when I was with Christian peacemaker teams in Colombia, I noticed in the big, beautiful square in Bogota, the Supreme Court building had a sign on top, inscription that said, "Arms gave us our freedom, laws keep it." And I thought to myself, that's not true. Arms didn't give you your freedom. It was your refusal to have anything but freedom that gave you your freedom. The methods you choose to make that certain, you always have a choice between violence and nonviolence. And what matters is not so much which one you use, but which one, the fact that you're not going to take no for an answer, that you're not going to give up your freedom. Now, what's been neat since the 40 years I've been studying, just in the last 10 or 12 years, to see so many scientific disciplines come and say that nonviolence works better. And here's all the reasons for it, from neurobiology to political science, the political science in particular, I think everybody here is probably familiar with Chenoweth and Stefan's study that's been updated since then, but proved that of all the conflicts they studied between 1900 and 2006, if you use nonviolence to overthrow a dictator or to get rid of a occupying foreign power, you were twice as likely to succeed if you used nonviolence. In the face of that kind of scientific evidence, it's really hard to see why anybody would choose violence if their point was to gain democracy or freedom or human rights. Mm-hmm. Now, if your desire is to dominate somebody, then absolutely you need violence. Mm-hmm. And that's the decision that the peoples of the world have to make. Do we want a system that promotes oppression and allows oppression, or do we want a system that can win freedom and democracy or whatever life we choose without the ability to create oppression?
Well, this might be an excellent place to turn it over to questions from our audience, because you've done such a beautiful, powerful job of really summarizing the challenges we face in the world and the solution and how we move toward that. So let's go ahead and open it to questions. Melanie?
Thank you, Arthur. And thank you, John. Wow, so hopeful and beautiful. We do have the choice to do nonviolence, and just the whole idea of sending help to people so they can do nonviolent action. And it is the most powerful way. So, and it lasts. So that's so wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. Yes, we want to get to questions, and let's go to Joanne first. Joanne, if you could unmute, that would be great.
Oh yes, I'm very much impressed with what you're saying. Have you written down these ideas in some kind of format that we can share when we don't have you personally telling us? Are there books that you've written or articles, and how could we access them?
No, I've written a few editorials here and there. I haven't written much. I just finished a book chapter, although the editors just sent it back for more revisions. There's a book coming out, it should be by April, by Bristol Press, called Unarmed Civilian Protection, A New Paradigm for Human Security. Unarmed Civilian Protection, A New Paradigm for Human Security, that I wrote a chapter explaining how I think we might be able to ramp up from peace teams now having a few dozen people to the hundreds or many thousands that we need to make them successful. So that will be coming out. And meanwhile, that's what recordings of webinars. I went into a lot of detail about Ukraine for World Beyond War. That's available online just last week.
Okay, we'll go ahead and go to Steve. Steve, go right ahead.
I came across a Mandela quote that was great, and it's very short. To make peace with an enemy, one must work with the enemy, and that enemy becomes your partner. Mm-hmm. Now, I mentioned this to my friend, who's a more conservative bent, and his response was, well, that's all fine and good, but the problem is that your enemy needs to want to make peace with you as well. So it's kind of, the ball is in the enemy's court from my friend's perspective. And I was wondering how, John, how you'd respond to how would I respond to my friend's statement?
Well, it'd be fun if we had more time. I'd say let's go back and forth on role plays a little bit. But my initial thought is what your friend has done is what almost everybody who supports violence and military solutions has done. And that is they've given up their own personal agency to give power to someone else. How many times have you heard, oh, Hitler did this and Hitler did that, and Putin is, it's his problem. It's not. We have agency. And when you surrender how you're going to respond to what the other guy says, you're giving up your human agency. And that's maybe one of the main differences between violence and nonviolence. Nonviolence, you take responsibility for your own behavior. With violence, you're implying that the other person, you're forced by the other person to follow his behavior.
And how could I exercise my agency? Just if my friend asked me, well,
with an enemy, well, I would start by quoting Abraham Lincoln, who said the best way to destroy an enemy is to make him your friend. And there are lots of ways to do that. And if you look at nonviolent methodology, I'm sitting on a desk here because we're moving with all my books about nonviolence, and I get there's volumes written about the methods of nonviolence that do that engage another person who you might consider your enemy in a way that makes it harder for him to do violence and easier for him to connect with you. Or at least if he doesn't want to connect with you, at least just defend yourself in a way that doesn't anger him more.
Right.
Wow.
Okay.
I've seen these work on the ground in South Sudan. I've had guns pointed into my face. It's not as simple as just talking everybody out of it. It's you're whole
Right.
attitude toward another person. Most people who do violence, soldiers, right? They're trying to do one of two things. They're living in fear. They're either afraid somebody's going to hurt them, or they want to use power to make someone else afraid. When you take fear out of the equation, see, your friend is coming from a place of fear.
Right.
And there's much more power in love than there is in fear. And by love, I simply mean wishing the best for the other person, no matter how bad their behavior is.
Right.
That's
I mean, he's
extremely
typical of
powerful.
an American. He's a spectator of the violence, not really a participant in the situation. So he's like, what am I supposed to do? Write a letter to Putin or what? So how does someone who's a typical American who sees the news, what action should they take? And I'll end it there because I know I've gone over my.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we've sent almost as many weapons. The amount of aid to this package for Ukraine is equal to the whole Russian military budget already. So the first thing is to stop sending more weapons, because nothing's going to happen except the destruction of Ukraine with more weapons. And then do negotiations, but not negotiations alone. You have to do all the things that could have prevented this war. As soon as you have a ceasefire and you're negotiating the end to it, part of that has to be things put in place that weren't put in place before, like certain kinds of disarmament, not threatening behavior. And the most obvious one is not threatening to use nuclear weapons. See, the US reserves its right to use nuclear weapons first if it feels like it. And that thinking is what allowed Putin to have this invasion. He couldn't have invaded without the threat of nuclear weapons. And so there's a whole system of things that you would do. I'd go to the World Beyond War website and all the things, I think 40 things that Russia and the US could have done to prevent this war at the start of the war.
Great. Thank you very much.
Wow. And we have more. Brian wants to add to this conversation. Brian, go right ahead. Unmute, please.
Thank you for your work. I have found through a practice of compassionate listening that when we bridge to the other and listen for what they value, we can find a common theme that connects us. Once that's acknowledged, the other's defenses and insistence on their position begins to drop as you begin to talk about the possibility of us working together in partnership, just like the quote that you cited, Steve. Now, I want to just add one more aspect of this. I'm sure that all of us have an inner critic. We have judgments about ourselves. And look at that voice as the enemy, or look at that voice as the other that we objectify and we try to avoid dealing with. If we personalize that relationship inside with the same methodology of nonviolence and making peace together within, then we come into a situation in a great state of peace, because we understand that every human being is dealing with an inner conflict, and the objectification of the other is something that we use to avoid dealing with our own inner conflict and lack of inner peace. I'll leave it there. Anyone want to comment? I appreciate it. Thank you.
Brian, how to take that, which sounds like a very personal, very relevant to interpersonal relationships between your family, your friends, maybe your coworkers. What do you do with an enemy who's shelling your country? And I think it has applications there too. One of the things that I learned from the leaders of the Romanian Peace Institute while I was there was just how much the Ukrainians were undermining their own war efforts by buying into Putin's propaganda to his people about who the Ukrainians were. In other words, when talked to a lot of people, again, these are people who had come from a peace building background, were saying it's so wonderful to see Ukrainian ethnic social cohesion come about. That's what's given us the power to resist. It's not the weapons. That's one way they could have done it. But the fact that they all came together and say, we're not going to be occupied by Russia. That's where their freedom is going to come from. Now they have a choice as to continuing a war, which has the very likely possibility of making their country look like Iraq after we finished with it, or after Afghanistan does now, or we could all end up looking like that with the nuclear Armageddon. We can't end that, forget about that threat to us. That's the greatest threat to the whole world. And that's the biggest reason this war has to stop, is because nobody can control it if it goes on. And so connecting with the humaneness in your enemy is what you want to do. If I were approaching the Russians, and I think the best way to stop this war, besides just negotiations, is to undermine Russian popular support for the war. It doesn't have much. It really doesn't. We all saw the pictures of, what was her name? I have it here, Marina Desyanikova, right? The state television newscaster holding up a sign that said no war. She was immediately arrested. Well, if you think Russia's, just a god awful place, and they do have tens of thousands of Russian protesters in jail over this, she's still free. I don't know how all that works, but it shows, there's just not one tremendous evil where everybody dies if you protest the government. Tennis players, Andrei Rublev, won in Dubai, and as the TV cameras were congratulating him, he wrote "No war" on the camera lens. That kind of resistance is bigger in Russia than we've ever had here. A Russian news source just said 700,000 Russian young men have left the country rather than go to war. How many went to Canada? A few thousand from the US, maybe 10,000? I mean, the Russians are so much more resistant to this than Americans are to our wars, and our wars were certainly no more just than this one, that we've got a lot of hope there. And we want to do everything to support them. And the best way to support them, Brian, is exactly what you said. Connect with the humanity of the average Russian. If you say we're never going to let anybody speak Russian in Ukraine, when 75% of the people in Ukraine speak Russian and 30% of them speak almost all Russian, and say they can't do it, you're not making friends. You're playing into Putin's propaganda that they're trying to erase everything about Russia from this country. So you want to treat your enemy as well as possible while letting him know at the same time he's not allowed to hurt you, and he may not even be welcome there. But the best way to end this war is to undermine Russian support for this war while letting Putin save face. Because if you say, like our president said early in the war, oh, we just got to get rid of this guy, it has to be regime change, then Putin says, see, that's all they want to do is kill your leader and get rid of your country and break us up. And there are US papers, RAND Corporation, saying how to destroy the Soviet Union. That's in history. Whether anybody's intentionally trying to do that, I don't know. It doesn't matter. Putin could point to those and say, look, that's what they're trying to do. And every bit of hate, Russian hate, that is done in the Ukraine plays into Putin's hands. Now, the hard part, and another reason to go with nonviolence instead of violence, is to win a war, you have to use violence. You have to out-violence the bad guys. And to do that, human beings don't do that easily. They don't like to kill one another for the most part. It takes a lot of training to get the soldiers to kill. And there's a huge history of how resistant we are to killing. So you have to demonize the enemy a lot. We had one guy at a meeting, he kind of blew both me and the guy from Patria away, because he had been trained in peace building, but he said, to win the war, we've just got to teach everybody violent extremism, because that's what you have to do. That's what war is, violent extremism. He says, and then we have to retrain them into not having violent extremism after the war. And we both just looked at ourselves saying, what is this guy saying? And whatever you do during the war is going to have lasting effects. And that's the downside of war.
Wow, this is so interesting. Thank you. Oh my gosh. Okay, well, let's see. We have a few more questions, so we want to get to everyone. So if you can ask your questions real quick or make your comment quickly. Let's go to Glenn next. Glenn, go right ahead.
Yeah, I'm glad John has been lifting up the power of nonviolent resistance. And on January 11, on this series, I'll be presenting a compelling case that we would have better national security in the US if we were to abolish the Pentagon and organize a massive campaign of civilian nonviolent resistance in order to protect us from any invader or whatever. And I put in the chat a link to the TV program that I had produced earlier this year about that. It makes a compelling case. And the article I wrote that fleshes that out and gives more examples is even more compelling than the TV program. But check the link in the chat, and then tune in on January 11 on this program, and we'll learn more about nonviolent national defense and how powerful and practical it is.
There's really something I'd like to say about that, but I think, Glenn, you and I need some conversations later. So let's finish the questions now. There is one more point I wanted to make, but let's take a couple questions.
Okay, don't forget it. Don't forget. All right, let's go to Jack. Jack, if you want to go ahead and unmute.
I think definitely you're speaking to a degree about tactical empathy. How do you talk down a terrorist, right? And you get it, you have to, what is it, what are they, where are they coming from? Where can you really get there? And I know at this level, it's very difficult, but I'm thinking of a couple of things in terms of human determination. I saw footage in Vietnam that was only released to some people. And they were pushing cannons in the mud, inch by inch up the hill to dig them in. And my friend, who is the most decorated French Foreign Legion warrior ever, said, you will never defeat that kind of determination. It's like the mother where the child is abducted and none of the tribe can find the child up the mountain. They give up. And the next morning, she comes down with the child on her back. And they said, how did you do that? And she said, it wasn't your child. And so that determination of the Ukrainian people. But we had a presentation at Rotary the other night by a pilot, a NATO pilot, with a lot of experience and talking about how poor the Russian aviation industry and like it's very, very poor there. He gave examples of the airports that they flew into and what the condition of the planes were and all of that. And there, but he also said that while they're flying in the air above Berlin with the instrumentation they have, they can detect a MiG jet starting up in Moscow, that every motor has its signature. And that's how sophisticated the US to a degree is militarily. But what my feeling is, and what Glenn was saying, I have to agree that that military industrial complex that's using the Ukraine like a little training ground for all of their sophisticated weaponry. It's like Los Angeles Police Department have a place where they train, right? Well, I got a feeling that the US is using Ukraine as a training center right now with the testing out different equipment, testing out whatever. And so for the future of our children, there's a very good meeting that I just became aware of on Saturday morning. I would encourage people to take a look at. It's called thecreativesociety.com. It's going to be a new way forward. And there were some Rotarians that presented that I watched last night. And beyond the Ukrainian war, where we're just fighting as people, is the state of the environment right now. That in 2022, which has not really been released to the public, what is actually going on environmentally with 195-mile-an-hour winds and earthquakes and tornadoes. And I'm looking out my window in Canada right now, and it isn't even November 11th, and I have 2.5 feet of snow in the yard. That is unlike anything we have seen for the past while. So take a look at the idea of creativesociety.com, because I think that might be a place that we all fit in to figure out how we go forward to a much greater future than what we seem to be on the avalanche track with right now. Thank you. John, you're great.
Let me just make a couple quick points, and hopefully still have enough time for a question or two after that. My general approach to helping people decide whether to use violence or nonviolence in any conflict situation, from interpersonal to this war, is leveling the playing field. It's something we just don't do in the peace movement, right? So when I was in South Sudan, I was excited about going there because Nonviolent Peaceforce had 200 people, right? I had been with Christian peacemaker teams and meta peace teams, DC peace teams, which could put the teams of, anywhere from 2 to 12 in one place at one time. But what I learned is those 200 had to be spread out into teams of 2 and 4 and 5 and 6. And we all saw the incredible work they did. I mean, everything we did made a difference in that war. And the people around it were very, very impressed. But when I asked, why don't you have large teams? I was told, well, this is humanitarian we're a humanitarian group, and there are humanitarian norms for protection, which is considered a good, like medical care and food and so forth. And that's what I wrote this chapter of this upcoming book on, is we need to be in the security field, and we need to level the playing field. By leveling the playing field means that if you're going to use violence to solve any problem, what can you get with nonviolence for the same resources? And the same resources are never there. You know, there were 17,000, I think, UN peacekeepers, armed peacekeepers in South Sudan. If somebody said, let's send in a team of 8, everybody would have laughed. And yet that's what we're doing. We've got to ask for the same resources. And to do that, of course, nobody's going to give us those resources until we have some demonstration projects. So I want to tell you about one that I thought of that's gaining some momentum, and that is the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is under Russian occupation. They're using it as a shield to shell Ukrainian cities across the river, and Ukrainians are shelling back, trying to avoid the plant. So there's a lot of fighting. The UN Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency is going nuts with this. He said, stop, this is not what nuclear plants are for. You could create another Chernobyl. So for 2 months now, he's trying to get the two sides to create a demilitarized zone. So what I'm doing is trying to put together a team, and we're getting close, but we're still not quite there, of enough volunteers with enough training to say, okay, we will monitor that demilitarized zone. And imagine if we could do that. You need to do the whole 30-kilometer radius that the guy wants, we would need more than 1,000 people. But I thought if we could get at least 50 or 100, we could at least offer that and put it on the table to bring attention to the dangers of the plant and to show that there are people willing to take the risks of soldiers to protect something that the military absolutely cannot protect. The military presence itself is the danger. So there's no argument about whether military or civilians could do better at this job. The military is the problem. So anyway, anybody that's interested in volunteering for that or wants to know more about it, get in touch with me. But it's that kind of demonstration project of doing something better than the military is that the world needs to see before you can convince them to put the resources into it instead of to the same old, same old.
Exactly. Oh my gosh. Can we go to Sharo? Sharo, go right ahead.
Hi there. I feel as though I'm jumping over to a region that where you've been, but it's not related to our current crises, but we do have a crisis still in Israel, Palestine. And I'm just wondering, when were you there and how was that experience? And what did you think of it all?
4 times I was there, once with the Gulf Peace team after the first Gulf War, and then I was with Christian Peacemaker team's inaugural team in Hebron, and went back with a Christian Peacemaker team delegation, and then with a Meta Peace team delegation just a couple of years ago. And that first deployment with Christian Peacemaker teams, when I saw the interference with violence, I mean, just by being human, just talking soldiers out of beating people or just being there so they wouldn't beat people, it was astounding how effective it was. And I thought, gosh, in 2 years, we'll have 40 people, and in 4 years, we'll have 400 people, and in 8 years, we'll have 4,000 people. We'll end this crisis. And there are just forces at work, both within the team and without, that just, there's something about growth that is hard for peace people to some extent. But again, it's that leveling the playing field. I dream all the time about having huge numbers of people. And again, that's what my book chapter is about. Gandhi said we need 100,000 people to even begin. Ron Sider, the Mennonite who led the vision for the Christian Pacemaker teams and just died, also called for 100,000 people. So working on the blocks about why that's not happening is the thing that interests me the most.
I used to take a lot of Americans over there, and it was very distressing to me. Jerry Levin, by the way, used to do what you're doing. I don't know if you ever ran into him, but anyway, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. And then before we go back to Arthur, you had something you wanted to say to Glenn. Do you remember what you were going to say, John?
You said, was it you that said, I'm not sure who said, somebody said you're using tactical empathy. Was
okay.
That right?
So you wanted to cover that a little bit before we?
Yeah, just that in South Sudan and in Palestine, the thing was tactical empathy, where you could engage people directly. You were there, physically present. In the Ukrainian war, as I visited the Nonviolent Peaceforce office there, they said you really can't do that kind of thing because the front is 30 kilometers apart. just shelling back and forth. So it's really hard to get to people. So what we need in this case is strategic empathy, like the things I'm mentioning. Let's not demonize Putin. He's doing a lot of terrible, evil things like we have, and connect with the parts where he's right. If you listen to his speeches, he's right about a lot of stuff, and he's god awful wrong about a lot of other stuff. But give him credit for the good and call him on the bad, rather than saying this guy's pure evil, you can never talk to him, nothing but getting rid of him will ever work, because that plays right into his hands. And I've talked to some people in Moscow. Luckily, you can have some secure channels, and they say yes. In Moscow, what we have here is a third of the people hate this war, but it's painful to speak up about it because you could be punished so severely. A third could try not to think about it, and a third will support Russia no matter what. And I thought, that's pretty close to my country here in Vermont. We have these F-35s preparing for the end of the world, and a third of the people will defend them to the nth degree. You can't even talk. I couldn't get a resolution passed against, well, I got lots of resolutions passed against them, but I couldn't get the state legislature to pass a resolution against them because the jingoists just got up and said, how dare you? These boys are saving Ukraine, and if you speak out now, it just undermines their whole program. So in every country, there is that group that just believes God and country, right or wrong, and will defend it to the nth degree. And getting around that is the way not to get around that, of course, is to demonize Putin, and so he can point to how much you're demonizing him to keep those supporters around him on his side. Whereas if you say, we love Russians, heck, most of the people in Ukraine used to love Russians, and not so much anymore. We love you guys. We know you want the same thing we do. We want freedom and safety, but get out of our country, will you please? And we'll help you. We'll give you whatever else you need. Oh, you feel threatened? Okay, U.S. can send its nuclear weapons home or get rid of them altogether. They don't have to have nuclear weapons on Russia's border and Poland and Turkey and Belgium and Netherlands. They shouldn't be there. And that's a negotiating point. There's all kinds of strategic empathy we could use to end this war.
Wow, John, so hopeful and so wonderful and great tips. We can all learn from you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And now I'll go back to Arthur. Arthur, take it away.
Well, John, this was really extraordinary. What an incredible encyclopedia of nonviolent action you are. It was really terrific. And I also want us to salute David Hartsoe. He's the one who co-founded World Beyond War and the Nonviolent Peaceforce, and he's also with us here on the call today. Hats off to you, David. And with that, I want to thank all of you for joining us, and thank you for joining us this and every week on the episodes of the People Powered Planet podcast.
World citizen, lift up your voices. Oh, we got something to say. All we need is the same directions, heading in one way.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to our channel and like this video.